Ever had to stand up to someone everyone else feared?
When my mother called me the night before Lauren's baby shower, I thought maybe, for once, she was going to ask me if I needed anything, or just check in on how I was doing. Because despite all the years of feeling like the extra in my own family story, there's still this small, stupid part of me that hopes one day they might actually treat me like I matter just as much as my sister. But no, she didn't even bother with hello beyond a quick "you busy" before launching straight into her real reason for calling, which was to tell me, in that same polite but cutting tone she's used my entire life, "Listen, tomorrow is about Lauren. And I don't want any drama, so just, please don't make this about you. Keep quiet." And I sat there on the phone, staring at my own reflection in the dark screen of my laptop, wondering if she even heard herself. Because I hadn't done a single thing to make her think I would ever show up at a baby shower and try to steal my pregnant sister's spotlight, but somehow, in her mind, that warning was necessary, as if my mere existence was a risk she had to manage. It's not like this is new. Lauren has been the star since we were kids, the straight-A student, the homecoming queen, the one whose soccer trophy sat front and center in the living room while my debate medals and science fair ribbons were stuffed into a drawer in the hallway. Birthdays, graduations, engagements, every milestone was an all-hands-on-deck production for her, while mine were a kind of polite obligation that everyone seemed eager to get through. And I learned early on that when it came to family gatherings, my role was to show up, smile, and keep whatever I was actually thinking to myself, because anything else was causing tension or being negative. But lately, there's been this undercurrent between me and Jason, her husband, that no one else seems to notice, and the only reason I've kept it buried is because I decided months ago that Lauren didn't deserve to have her pregnancy turned into a nightmare. I told myself that whatever I knew about him, whatever I'd seen, it could wait, because I wasn't going to be the reason she ended up crying herself to sleep every night before giving birth. Still, that doesn't mean I've forgiven him, or that I've forgotten the way he looked me dead in the eye when we last spoke about it and said, "Let's just keep this between us for the family's sake." So when Mom hit me with her little speech, I bit my tongue and said, "Sure, Mom. I'll keep quiet, because what else was I going to say? That her golden girl's husband wasn't exactly the flawless, devoted partner she thought he was? That the only reason I'd been at peace about the baby shower was because I planned to slip in, hand over the gift, and slip right back out without making small talk with people who think my main contribution to this family is showing up on time? No, that wouldn't go over well, and honestly, I was tired. Tired of fighting battles I couldn't win, tired of being the one who always came off as difficult, no matter how carefully I phrased things. The morning of the shower, I told myself I'd treat it like any other work event I didn't want to be at, stay neutral, keep my head down, and let the hours pass. And for the first hour or so, that's exactly what I did. I handed over my gift to Lauren. I smiled when people I barely knew told me how amazing she looked. I even laughed politely when one of her friends made a joke about how lucky I must feel to become Auntie Sarah. Inside, though, I kept thinking about the last time I'd seen Jason alone, and the way he'd tried to pretend nothing had happened, as if I'd just imagined it all, as if my silence had somehow erased the truth. I had no intention of breaking that silence in the middle of a crowded backyard full of Lauren's friends, family, and coworkers. But then, about halfway through, just as everyone was finding their seats and settling in for the food and the speeches, Jason stood up, glass in hand, and called for everyone's attention. I assumed he was about to toast Lauren, maybe thank people for coming, the usual predictable stuff. But then, out of nowhere, he said, "Before we begin, there's something you all should know about her," and he turned his head toward me. For a split second, I thought I'd misheard him. Conversations around the tables went silent, chairs creaked as people turned, and suddenly every face was angled toward mine. I felt my stomach tighten in that slow, sinking way it does when you realize you're about to be trapped in something you didn't agree to. He was smiling, but it wasn't the kind of smile that says you're about to hear something wonderful. It was the kind that makes you brace yourself without even knowing why. And in that exact moment, while I could feel my mother's eyes on me from across the table, I knew two things. First, that Jason was about to try something I wasn't going to like, and second, that if he wanted to drag me into the spotlight in front of everyone, I was going to make damn sure he'd regret it. Jason tapped his glass like he was auditioning for some leadership seminar, asked for everyone's attention with that friendly voice people use when they are about to do something calculated. And then he looked straight at me as if we were about to share a sweet little secret, and said that before we begin there is something you all should know about her, and I felt the entire room tilt toward me in that slow, invasive way that makes you understand you just became the main event without any warning, which is funny considering I was told to keep quiet and not make anything about me, because apparently that decision was already made for me by the one person who has the most to gain from steering the story. He started with this polished praise that sounded generous on the surface, the kind of speech that makes casual guests nod along because it checks all the nice boxes. He said I had shown up for the family during a hard season, that I had been a steady presence while everyone else was overwhelmed, that I had been the quiet glue holding things together when emotions ran high, and I watched people soften as he spoke, which was the point, because then if anything ever came out that did not fit the pretty picture, he could point back to this toast and say he had always been honest and grateful, and that any other interpretation of events was malicious or confused. He pivoted with a laugh and said that families are messy and imperfect, and that sometimes people say things they do not mean, sometimes they vent to the wrong person, sometimes they make dumb choices because they are scared. And then he smiled like a man confessing to a parking ticket rather than a betrayal, and said that I had been kind enough to forgive him for a period when he was not the best version of himself, and that I had kept my mouth shut because I cared about Lauren and the baby, and he wanted everyone to know how much that meant to him. There it was, neatly packaged and gift-wrapped, the suggestion of a rough patch with no specifics, the preemptive framing of me as a benevolent confidant rather than a witness, the implication that anything I might say later would be breaking a sacred trust instead of dragging a truth into the light, and while the table murmured its approval and my mother placed a proud hand over Lauren's forearm like she was soaking in a sermon about family unity, I felt the old pressure in my throat, that heavy warning that says swallow it down, be the bigger person, do what is best for the baby, and on a different day I might have done exactly that. Jason glanced at me in that quick, nervous way that people do when they want to check whether their knife actually landed, and I realized he was not just celebrating me, he was corralling me, building a little fence with compliments and coded confessions so that if I dared to open my mouth later, people would hear betrayal instead of relief, and they would say, how could you do this after he trusted you and thanked you in front of everyone? And they would forget that trust is not something he actually earned. So I lifted my glass and smiled back at him, and, because I am not the actress they think I am, the smile probably looked a little crooked, but it was enough to make him relax, which is when I decided I was done letting him decide what I am and what I am not. I asked if I could say a few words, soft voice, nothing dramatic, just a sister thanking people for coming, and the room gave me the space, and I cleared my throat and said I am really glad we are all here to celebrate Lauren because this pregnancy has been a long road, and she deserves an uncomplicated day, and then I thanked Jason for his kind words about me being steady and quiet, and I added that I agree with him about families being messy and imperfect, which is why the people who love us should never put us in positions where we have to hold secrets that do not belong to us, and the air changed, not enough to call it a scene, but enough that a few heads turned toward him before they turned back to me. I did not spill anything, I did not accuse him of anything, I just put a small pin in his balloon, a gentle reminder that what he called kindness had a cost, and that cost was me standing here holding weight no one bothered to ask if I could carry. He laughed a little too loudly and said I am grateful, truly, and the moment slid past like nothing, which is exactly what I needed, because the point was not to explode, the point was to make him feel the clock start ticking. I sat down, and while the servers moved around us and conversations resumed, I pulled out my phone under the table and set a delayed send on an email that had been sitting in my drafts for weeks, a polite, neutral summary addressed to Lauren and only to Lauren, with a subject line that read something boring like housekeeping and a few attachments that were not explicit, not scandalous, just enough to force a real conversation that could not be spun with a smile and a toast, because sometimes you do not knock the door down, you just unlock it and walk away. My mother leaned in and whispered that I handled that nicely and that she was proud of me for staying measured, which was probably the most backhanded blessing I have ever received, and I nodded as if I agreed. While across the table, Jason sipped his drink with that forced casual posture that men use when they are trying not to look like they are watching you, and I let him have the illusion that his speech had placed a seatbelt on me, because it would make the next part cleaner. I texted him a single line that said, "Thank you for your honesty. Glad we are aligned," and he wrote back immediately with a thumbs-up wordy response that said he really appreciates my maturity and that he knew I would not let this day be overshadowed. And I read it twice because it sounded less like gratitude and more like a warning disguised as a compliment, which has always been his tactic. Then I did something very small and very deliberate that would seem harmless to anyone who looked over my shoulder. I opened our last message history from months ago, the one with the timestamps and the apologies and the little promises. And I used the print function to save it as a tidy file with a bland name, nothing that would scream scandal, and I added it to the same email thread as a quiet placeholder, not sent yet, not even addressed yet, just parked where I could reach it with one tap. If I needed to, because the game he tried to play with that toast was not about truth, it was about narrative, and if he wanted to play narrative, I would give him structure, sequence, and context, which are the three things that kill spin faster than shouting. Lauren stood to hug a friend. My mother started talking about centerpieces with someone at the next table. The room drifted back into its ordinary party rhythm, and I sat there feeling the calm that comes right after you choose a lane. Because I had respected the request to keep quiet, and I had also refused the role he assigned me, which means I had kept my promise and broken his plan in the same breath, and that is the kind of revenge I can live with. And just when I thought I could finally breathe, his phone lit up inches from his hand with a message preview that was not meant for public eyes, and even though I could not read the full thing, I caught my own name in the first few words, which was all I needed to see to understand that his toast was not a conclusion but a first move, and if that is how he wanted to play, then it was time for me to stop being polite and start being precise. The thing about being told to keep quiet is that it only works on someone who does not already know how to swallow things whole, and I have been doing that since high school, back when Lauren could do no wrong and I learned to carry my reactions like contraband. Which is probably why, months ago, when I first realized something was off with Jason, my first instinct was not to blow it up, it was to gather details and make sure I was not reading a shadow as a monster, because if I have learned anything, it is that once you say something out loud in a family like ours, it grows teeth and a tail, and pretty soon the story is not what happened, but how you made people feel by saying it. The first sign was stupidly ordinary. He asked me one night if I could take a call from him because he was worried about Lauren feeling overwhelmed and did not want to add to her stress. And when I picked up, I could hear music in the background and laughter that did not sound like a television, and he told me he had stepped out to get her favorite dessert but was stuck waiting on an order, and I said sure, no problem, and then he forgot to hang up properly, and I heard a voice ask him if he needed to go, and he said in that low, performative whisper that makes my skin crawl, "It is fine. She is cool. She gets it." I sat there holding the phone, listening to a conversation I had not consented to be part of, and when the call finally ended, I told myself there are a dozen ways to explain this, and most of them are harmless, so I did nothing except pay attention, which is both my curse and my advantage. Over the next few weeks, little things lined up in a way that looked like a pattern even when everyone else insisted it was random. A late-night payment to a rideshare service far from their house on a night he told Lauren he was with a friend. A saved contact in his favorites that did not match a name I recognized. A message preview that flashed on his phone when he asked me to take a photo of him and Lauren at a family dinner because he wanted both of them in the shot, which would have been sweet if not for the line that said "You still up?" and his hand jerking back so fast I almost dropped the phone. I did not screenshot anything that night because I was not in the habit of documenting family members like a private investigator, but I did what I always do when I am being gaslit by appearances, which is to trust the quiet voice that says you are not crazy, there is a shape here, and once you trace it you will not be able to unsee it. I confronted him once, calmly, in the kind of voice a nurse uses when she tells you it is going to hurt even if you know she is lying, and I said I think you are talking to someone you should not be talking to while Lauren is pregnant. And I am not interested in the cute version of it. I am interested in whether you plan to stop, and he looked offended like I had accused him of a felony rather than a weakness. Then slid into a performance about stress and fear and how men do stupid things when they feel helpless, and none of it surprised me except the part where he asked me not to tell Lauren because he was going to fix it, and he did not want to put more stress on the pregnancy. And in that moment he placed a weight in my hands that did not belong to me and called it love for the family, which is a trick as old as weddings. I said this ends now, full stop, no lingering chats and no late-night confessions to someone who is not your wife, and he nodded too quickly, promised in those eager, empty words people use when they want the conversation to end, and for a little while he played the role of reformed man, which almost fooled me until I realized the energy had not disappeared, it had just gone underground. So when he toasted me at the shower and tried to fold me into a story as the quiet glue, he was not thanking me, he was preemptively indicting me, because if I spoke later, it would sound like betrayal instead of relief, and that is why. When his phone lit up with a preview that had my name in it, I did not need to read the rest to know I had waited long enough for him to be decent on his own. I stepped out to the hallway under the excuse of taking a call and opened the draft I had prepared weeks earlier, the one I told myself I would only ever send if he forced my hand, and I changed one sentence that had always felt too kind, the part where I gave him the benefit of the doubt, and I replaced it with a line that simply said I am done protecting people who use my silence as cover. I did not send it to the whole family because I am not interested in spectacle. I set it to deliver to Lauren alone, to the email she uses for personal things that Jason does not check, with the attachments that show context rather than gossip, timestamps rather than accusations, because I do not need him to be a villain in a movie. I need my sister to see what I have been seeing for months, so she can make choices that are hers and not arrangements negotiated by other people's comfort. It would be a lie to say I was not shaking, because even when you know you are right, there is a cost to being the one who lights the fuse. And I could hear my mother's voice in my head telling me to think of the baby and think of the family and think of the event and think of appearances, and I did think of all of it. And then I thought about how many times I had been told to shrink for the sake of harmony while other people took up twice their share of space, and I realized the real kindness is not keeping a secret that keeps someone small, it is telling a truth that lets them decide how big they want to be. I hit schedule send for later that evening, because I did not want to turn the shower into a courtroom, and I returned to my seat with a steady face and a stomach that felt like an elevator dropping between floors. And when Jason caught my eye across the table, he looked relieved, which is the danger of being good at self-control. People mistake it for surrender. Still, I am not naive. I knew he would not let the day pass without tightening the net, so I baited him with a message that said we should talk after the party, and I saw the dots appear and disappear like he was pacing with his thumbs. And then he sent me this long ramble about trust and discretion and how grateful he is that we have clear boundaries, and I replied with a single line that said boundaries work both ways, which I knew would bother him because vague truths irritate people who depend on confusion. Within minutes my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize and a voice that said we do not know each other, but I think we share a problem, and I stepped outside to hear better and asked for a name, and she hesitated and then said enough to confirm what I already knew. That Jason had not ended anything, he had simply changed tactics, and that she had no interest in being a secret anymore. I thanked her for the facts, asked for timestamps, asked for anything in her own words rather than screens that could be spun as fake, and she sent me a short voice note that said he promised me a future, and I saved it not because I needed the drama but because hearing someone say the quiet part makes it harder to deny the loud part. By the time I walked back in, dessert plates were clinking and my mother was telling a story about Lauren's first steps like this was a celebration untouched by adult reality, and I sat there with my phone screen face down, knowing that when the scheduled email finally landed, I could not pull it back, and maybe some people would never forgive me for the timing, and maybe Lauren would cut me off for a while, and maybe my mother would add this to her private list of my alleged offenses. But I Also knew that for the first time in a long time, I had chosen a version of quiet that belonged to me, not to him, and that whatever happened next would not be my secret to carry anymore. And just as I swallowed that thought and tried to let it settle, I saw Lauren stand up to refill a drink, glance at Jason's phone on the table, and freeze when a new message preview flashed across the screen with a name I recognized from my hallway call, which is when my heartbeat finally slowed enough to let one clear idea through. I would not have to say a single word if he kept doing my work for me. When Lauren froze at the sight of that preview on Jason's phone, I watched something quiet shift in her face. Not a dramatic scene or a gasp or a dropped glass, just that tiny pause people do when their brain is trying to catch up to a thought it does not want. And I knew I had reached the point where restraint stops being noble and starts being a cover-up, so I took a long breath that did not look like a breath and decided I would guide the next 10 minutes in a way that looked like I was doing nothing at all, because if there is one thing I have learned, it is that you do not win these wars by shouting, you win them by making sure the truth walks into the room on its own two legs while everyone is looking. I asked Lauren if she wanted more water, and she nodded without looking at me, and while she moved toward the drink table I stood and asked Jason if he could take a few photos for Mom, since she loves having proof that our family is thriving, and I said it with that light sarcasm. He always mistakes for compliance, which made him grin like we were teammates again, and he unlocked his phone and handed it to me for a second so I could open the camera and frame the shot. Only I did not frame anything. I set the display to bright. I slid the notifications to show previews, and I handed it right back with a thank you that sounded so harmless. He did not clock the fact that I had just opened every window in his house. You would think the next part required some complex hack or a sneaky trick, but it did not, because men who build their alibi on charm depend on people staying polite. And all I did was walk back to my seat and send him a quick message from my phone that said thanks for the toast, would be great to chat later about boundaries and what we agreed on earlier this year, which I knew would light up his screen in front of whoever was looking. And I was not aiming to expose myself, I was aiming to trigger him, because anxious people reply fast, and sure enough his screen flashed with my name, and then with his reply that said of course, we are aligned, nothing to worry about. And then it flashed again with a different name that would mean nothing to a stranger, and everything to a wife who had just watched her husband rehearse a speech about family. I did not look at Lauren while it happened, because I did not want to push her into a scene before she was ready. I just sat there and asked Mom if she liked the dessert and smiled when an aunt told me I should think about hosting more often, and I let the phone do what phones do, which is tell on people who think they can be two different things in the same afternoon. Still, I did not want this to become a pile-on of screenshots and he said she said, because those stories get muddy fast and everyone goes home with their own version. So I reached for the cleanest lever I had, which was the woman Jason had been keeping in the wings, who had already made it clear she was done being a secret, and I wrote her a single sentence that did not threaten or beg. It just said, if you need to say your piece, today is your window, and I watched the typing bubble appear and disappear like a heartbeat before she replied with a quiet okay and a short line that said he promised me a future, then sent a small voice clip that was exactly what it needed to be. Not theatrical, not sobbing. Just a woman stating in her own words that a married man told her there would be a plan after the baby, and I did not blast it to the group. I did not wave it around. I simply saved it. Because Lauren would need something that did not look like my interpretation later, and I have learned the hard way that when you love someone you give them receipts that speak for themselves. Jason leaned toward me a few minutes later and asked, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, if we were good, and I said we are good if the truth is going to be the only language we speak from now on. And he chuckled like I was being cute and thanked me again for being such a steady presence, and if I had been a different woman I might have rolled my eyes, but instead I nodded and asked him to help Lauren move some gifts to the front so there would be more space, which made him stand and put his phone on the table for a moment while he reached for boxes, and right then another message preview slid across the screen with the same name as before, followed by a second one that said, "Are you with her right now?" And I did not move. I did not point. I did not make a sound. I just watched the exact thing I had been promised would never happen in front of the person who had the most right to see it. My mother, who has a radar for anything that could embarrass her, leaned in and asked if everything was all right, and I said absolutely. Which was not a lie, because sometimes what looks like a disaster is just an overdue conversation arriving at the door in a bright envelope. And as Mom turned back to her centerpiece talk, I saw Lauren reach for the phone the way someone reaches for a receipt they did not expect to sign, slow and careful and very sure, and she did not look at me when she picked it up, because she knew if she did she might change her mind, and she opened it and read enough to know that whatever story Jason had been telling was not the only version, and then she put the phone down so gently that no one would think anything had happened. Which is how you know a person is holding themselves together by force of will alone. I stood to collect plates, not because I am a server, but because people move differently around you when your hands are busy, and it let me drift toward the kitchen without looking like I was following anyone, and in the hallway I saw Jason step aside to take a breath. And for a second I thought he might just bail, which would have been easier for him and crueler for her, but he came back in with that fixed smile and asked if anyone wanted coffee, and right then Lauren touched his arm and said, in a voice so soft no one else noticed, "Can you help me for a second?" And she walked toward the kitchen without waiting for an answer, which told me she already knew what he was going to do and was not giving him the chance to do it in public. Here is the part one I'm not proud of but would do again without blinking. As Jason followed her, I stepped in front of my mother and asked her to show me where she bought the cake stand, because I wanted to get the same one, which made her talk for just long enough to keep her out of the kitchen. And while she explained the store and the coupon and how she got a deal, I watched the doorway and waited, and after a minute Lauren reappeared, face calm in that alarming way you only see when someone has already broken and rebuilt themselves in a single breath, and she was holding Jason's phone with the screen still open to the thread. And she looked at me for the first time since the preview flashed and said my name in a way that held gratitude and fury and grief all at once, then said, "Can we talk in the kitchen? Both of you, now." And the room kept chattering like nothing mattered while the three of us stepped into the place where the truth finally stops being a theory and turns into a decision. In the kitchen, Lauren set the phone on the counter like it was a fragile object that had already done enough damage, then looked at Jason with a steadiness I have only seen in her twice in my life. Once when she decided to leave a job that was wrecking her sleep, and once when she chose this marriage even after Dad warned her that charm is a nice front door but a terrible foundation, and she asked him, not with drama but with a kind of exhausted clarity that scares people into telling the truth, whether there was anything here that she did not already know, because if there was, this was the last moment he would get to offer it without an audience. And he started talking in circles about stress and fear and loneliness and how he had made dumb choices because he felt inadequate with the pregnancy and work and all the expectations, and she let him talk until the words began to repeat. Then she turned to me and asked if I had anything I needed to say, and I told her that I had tried to be the wall that held the wind back, that I had taken calls I did not want and kept quiet longer than I should have because I thought she needed peace more than she needed proof, but that I had reached a point where pretending this was not happening was doing her more harm than the truth ever could, and I added, because it mattered, that whatever she chose next was hers, not mine, and I would back it without turning it into a spectacle. Jason saw the opening and slid into it with a plea that would have worked 6 months ago, asking for one more chance and one more week and one more try, promising counseling and passwords and transparency and anything that sounded like structure. And I watched Lauren not look at me because she knew if she did she might borrow my spine, and she did not want that, so she kept her eyes on him and asked a very simple question that he could not make pretty, which was whether the other woman knew he was at his wife's baby shower while he was texting her, and the pause that followed was the longest sound in the room even though it was quiet, and when he finally said that it was complicated and that he had been trying to end it cleanly, she nodded once like a person confirming a diagnosis, then did something small and devastating. She pushed his phone back to him with 2 fingers and told him he could decide whether to be the man who walked out today because he could not stand in the truth, or the man who faced it and accepted the consequences, but either way, the baby would not be born into a lie. I told her that an email would arrive to her later with a tidy chronology that did not yell or accuse, just lined up the months and the messages and the promises in the order they happened, along with a short voice note from someone who had realized she was not special, just convenient, and that she should read and listen when she was alone so that no one could spin it over her shoulder. And Jason snapped that I was orchestrating this like a show, that I had been waiting for my moment to get. Even after a lifetime of living in Lauren's shadow, which was a nice line if you have never met me, and I told him that this is not a show and that if it were, I would have burned you in the first act, but I did not. Because I was trying to protect a sister who did not need to bleed for your panic, and then I said the only sentence I needed to say, which was that he should not mistake my restraint for loyalty to him. We were 3 people in a kitchen, and the party kept humming on the other side of the doorway, which is how life works when the ground shifts under your feet, plates clinking and a playlist rolling while the truth redraws a family in the next room. And Lauren took a breath and said, "Here is what is going to happen," and the calm in her voice was the kind that ends negotiations. He would return to the party. He would thank people for coming. He would not touch a microphone. He would not try to spin this with gratitude or flowery language. He would help carry gifts to the car. He would leave alone, and he would not come back tonight. She would call him tomorrow with a time to talk with a counselor present. And if he tried to contact the other woman again in the meantime, the conversation would not be necessary, because papers would be. And then she looked at me and said, "I want you beside me when we walk back out, because I am done being embarrassed by the wrong thing." We stepped into the living room like nothing had happened, which felt obscene and necessary at the same time, and when the room called for a toast that was supposed to belong to Jason, I touched his wrist as I passed and said, "This one is not yours." And I took the glass and the tiny wireless mic that had been set out for the speeches, and I kept my voice even as I thanked everyone for showing up for Lauren, and I said that families are not perfect, that we all make mistakes, that the powerful thing is what you do after the truth shows up. And then I did the cleanest, sharpest thing I have ever done in my life. I congratulated Lauren on getting what every new mother deserves before her child arrives, which is clarity about who is in the room for the right reasons. And I told everyone to enjoy the afternoon because the baby is coming, and that is what actually matters. And I handed the mic to my mother before she could process what I had said and walked off to the side where I could see. Jason realized the room had tilted away from him without a single accusation spoken aloud. He tried to pull me aside with a hissed whisper about how I had humiliated him, and I told him that humility is not humiliation, that the difference is what you do after you are seen. And then I watched him weigh the urge to explode against the certainty that anything loud would make this worse for him, which is what control looks like when it finally fails, and he chose silence, because it was the only thing that did not cost him more in the moment. And he carried boxes to the car like a helpful man while Lauren thanked guests, and my mother smiled the tight smile of a woman trying to outrun a rumor that has already arrived at her front door. Before I left, I put one small card in Lauren's hand, not a dramatic letter or a manifesto, just a list of resources and a single sentence that said, "I will show up in whatever version of sister you need," which is the kind of promise that has weight without noise. And she squeezed my fingers hard enough to tell me she heard me, then whispered that she would read the email later and that she loved me even though she was furious at me for forcing this day to grow up. Which I understood, because love can hold 2 truths at once when it stops pretending. That night, the email landed exactly when I told it to, and he texted twice in the first hour before going quiet, and she called me close to midnight to say that the baby would have her last name on the hospital paperwork for now, that the nursery would not include any gifts with his face on them, that his key code no longer worked, and that tomorrow she wanted me there when she spoke to a counselor. And I lay there in the dark listening to a woman I have known my whole life step into the center of her own story without asking anyone's permission, and I thought about my mother's warning to keep quiet and not make this about me, and how funny it is that I won by doing exactly that. Because the final move was not a scene or a speech or a pile of screens, it was a clean shift in who gets to call something family, and when the house went still and my phone stopped buzzing, I felt the kind of silence that is not a punishment but a win, and I knew that whatever comes next will be messy and hard and real, and also mine, and that for once, in a room full of people who expected me to be small, I had made the smartest noise of all by refusing to shout and letting the truth speak in a voice it would be impossible to deny.